Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Kunja Bihari Gopi Janabalabha Giribardhari Gopi Janabalabha Giribardhari Yasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yasodanandana Brajajana Yasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Sodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ramo Hare Ramo Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ramo Hare Ramo Rama Ramo Hare Hare Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parvadikacharya Prabhupada Sri Śrīmad Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Grantaraj Śrīmad Ramayana Ki Samveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the Assembled Devotees. All glories to the Assembled Devotees. All glories to the Assembled Devotees. All glories to Shri Guru Shingo Ranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupaka Damahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Ishvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindubhya Evacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, so in Bhagavatam, we're on Canto 2, Chapter 9, Text 25, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Brahmovacha Bhagavan Sarvabhutanam Bhagavan Sarvabhutanam Adyaksho Vasthito Guham Adyaksho Vasthito Guham Veda Hyaprati Rudhena Veda Hyaprati Rudhena Prajnanena Chikirshitam Prajnanena Chikirshitam Brahmovacha Bhagavan Sarvabhutanam Adyaksho Vasthito Guham Veda Hyaprati Rudhena Prajnanena Chikirshitam Brahmovacha Bhagavan Sarvabhutanam Adyaksho Vastito Guham Veda Hyaprati Rudhena Prajnanena Chikirshitam. Brahma Uvacha, Lord Brahma said, Bhagavan, O my Lord, Sarvabhutanam, of all living entities, Adyakshaha, director, Avasthitaha, situated, Guham, within the heart, Veda, no. He, certainly, Apratirudena, without hindrance, Prajnanena, by superintelligence, Chikirshitam, endeavors. So the translation for this verse is as follows. Lord Brahma said, O personality of Godhead, you are situated in every living entity's heart as the supreme director, and therefore you are aware of all endeavors by your superior intelligence without any hindrance whatsoever. So I say, and you please repeat. Lord Brahma said, O personality of Godhead,
O personality of Godhead,
you are situated in every living entity's heart
you are situated in every living entity's heart
as the Supreme Director,
as the Supreme Director,
and therefore you are aware of all endeavors
you are aware of all endeavors
by your superior intelligence
by your superior intelligence
without any hindrance whatsoever.
without any hindrance whatsoever.
So, Prabhupada's purport. The Bhagavad Gita confirms that the Lord is situated in everyone's heart as the witness. This is not on. Hello?
Oh.
This is not on.
Oh.
Bhagavad Gita confirms that the Lord is situated in everyone's heart as the witness. And as such, he is the Supreme Director of sanction. The director is not the enjoyer of the fruits of action, for without the Lord's sanction, no one can enjoy. For example, in a prohibited area, a habituated drunkard puts forward his application to the director of drinking, and the director, considering his case, sanctions only a certain amount of liquor for drinking. Similarly, the whole material world is full of many drunkards, in the sense that each and every one of the living entities has something in his mind to enjoy, and everyone desires the fulfillment of his desires very strongly. The Almighty Lord, being very kind to the living entities, as the Father is kind to the Son, fulfills the living entity's desire for his childish satisfaction. With such desires in mind, the living entity does not actually enjoy, but he serves the bodily whims unnecessarily without profit. The drunkard does not derive any profit out of drinking, but because he has become a servant of the drinking habit and does not wish to get out of it, the merciful Lord gives him all facilities to fulfill such desires. The impersonalists recommend that one should become desireless, and others recommend banishing desires altogether. This is impossible. No one can banish desires altogether because desiring is the living symptom. Without having desires, a living entity would be dead, which he is not. Therefore, living conditions and desires go together. Perfection of desires may be achieved when one desires to serve the Lord, and the Lord also desires that every living entity banish all personal desires and cooperate with his desires. That is the last instruction of the Bhagavad Gita. Brahmaji agreed to this proposal, and therefore he is given the responsible post of creating generations in the vacant universe. Oneness with the Lord therefore consists of dovetailing one's desires with the desires of the Supreme Lord. That makes the perfection of all desires. The Lord, as the supersoul in the heart of every living being, knows what is in the mind of each living entity, and no one can do anything without the knowledge of the Lord within. By his superior intelligence, the Lord gives everyone the chance to fulfill his desires to the fullest extent, and the resultant reaction is also awarded by the Lord. Brahmuvacha Bhagavan Sarvabhutanam Adyaksho Vasteto Guham Veda Hyaprati Rudena Pragyanena Chikirshitam. Lord Brahma said, O personality of Godhead, you are situated in every living entity's heart as the Supreme Director, and therefore you're aware of all endeavors by your superior intelligence without any hindrance whatsoever. So this verse brings up a very important point, that desire is the inescapable quality of a living entity. There's no such thing as a living being without desire or personal desire. And desire is that thing which gives us direction in life, just like a boat in the water may have powerful propellers, but it's the rudder that gives the boat its direction. The way the rudder turns is the way the boat moves. Actually, in one sense, it's the opposite way. The way the rudder turns is the opposite way that the boat moves, but it's pretty much the same thing in one sense. So, we and every other living entity in our material world have our individual desires. And we're placed in this material world to try to fulfill those material desires, because we were not satisfied in the spiritual world with simply serving the Supreme Lord. We come to this material world, and here we try to fulfill our desires separate from the Lord. And this material world is a vast array of possible modes of material enjoyment. So everywhere we look, we see possible circumstances, situations, objects, and even other people. And we imagine ways that we can enjoy via these various situations, locations, people, objects, etc. However, there's another factor. It's not just a playground for kindergartners. There's something else at play. And that is karma, or what we can call also the will of the Lord. So karma is the will of the Lord, but in a more impersonal sense, whereas the will of the Lord is the waters that direct us in some direction, and it's not so impersonal, it's more direct. And since today is Ram Navami, this basic idea fits in nicely with a excerpt that I wanted to highlight in the Ramayana, because we see that everyone has desires. As Prabhupada says here, desire cannot be gotten rid of. If you want to get rid of desires, that's also a desire. So you can't get rid of desire. Even if you want to get rid of desires, a desire to get rid of desires is a desire. So in some way or shape or other, we have desires. The question is not to get rid of desires. The question is simply to understand which desires are spiritual and which are material. Material desires always lead to a dead end and to frustration. Spiritual desires are always difficult and require certain kinds of austerities, but they lead to a situation where one feels knowledgeable, satisfied, and one actually is becoming gradually in contact with the Supreme Lord. So we can see this kind of thing playing out. The episode from the Ramayana that I wanted to focus in on today occurred after, Kaikeyi had been diverted in her intelligence by Manthara and had asked her husband, Dasarath, to set aside coronating Ramachandra and instead coronate her own son, Bharat. So we know that Kaikeyi was the mother of Bharat, Kaushalya was the mother of Ramachandra, and Sumitra was the mother of Shatrughna and Lakshman. So as Lakshman followed Ramachandra, Shatrughna also was devoted to Bharat. So they were like two sets of two. When Kaikeyi had been diverted, she demanded Dasarath to comply with her wishes. And because Dasarath had given his word, and we see this as a strong theme in Vedic literature, that when someone gives their word, if it becomes inconvenient, one does not go back on one's word. One does not renege on a promise or a commitment or a vow. And this is what makes a kshatriya a kshatriya. If a leader or an organizer or a warrior or someone who has the protection of the state as their duty cannot be trusted to live up to their word, then essentially there's only chaos. Order can only be established to a certain extent in human society, but a human society that is completely disordered is a painful situation, and it's a very horrible situation. So some order has to be there. That order can be based on material principles and fear, or that order can be based on spiritual principles and progressive purification. Now, if a kshatriya says one thing and does another, then we can understand that chaos will become the order of the day, and that gradually everything will unravel like a sweater that has a loose thread, and gradually the loose thread unravels the entire sweater. So we have our desires, but at the same time we are situated in a world that has its own direction. It is not geared to fulfill our desires. Certainly we can attempt to fulfill our desires as we are pushed in the river of daily events. So from one day to the next, there is a flow of time, and the time factor pushes us in certain directions. If we are not at all interested in spiritual life, then time pushes us according to the laws of karma. If we are interested in spiritual life, then the Supreme Lord is directing our flow. But in either case, we're being pushed along. And we see that in this story of the exile of Ramachandra, even though he is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he plays the role as if he were a regular human being, a regular kshatriya. He plays that role. And everyone with him is also in that role. And Lord Ramachandra demonstrates what ideal leadership should be like. Why should a leader behave in one way or behave in another way? What are the key elements in the character of someone who is genuinely qualified to be a leader? To be genuinely qualified to be a leader, one has to be very self-controlled. One has to understand what the real common good of the state really is. And if one is self-controlled and understands what the common good of the state is, then one can be a leader. And one must be careful about what one commits to or vows or promises. Because if the leader is seen to make false promises or unable to commit or unable to control himself, then such leaders do not inspire the people in general to a higher goal. Instead, such leaders suggest that one should rather do whatever we feel we want to do. Whether that has good or bad consequences is not considered. Because that's generally how those who are moved or caught in material desire act. They only think what will make them happy, as we said, and as this said in our purport, that the Supreme Lord puts us in this material world like a father who allows various kinds of drunkard living entities. So to come to this material world, we are like drunkards. We try to enjoy, and we're intoxicated by the lure of material enjoyment. The lure is there. However, material enjoyment never really pans out the way we imagine it will. So Lord Ramachandra was given the directive by his father, who also had no desire whatsoever to give this directive, but he was obliged to do it because he made a promise, and that promise was made to Kaikeyi when she saved his life on the battlefield. So he made the promise that she could have some boon from him whenever she wanted. And she couldn't think of anything at the time, so she simply took a rain check or deferred to some future time. And of course, Manthara decided that this was the right time. And we see how, as we mentioned last week, the idea of envy comes into the picture, that one wants some special recognition, one wants some special facility for sense gratification. So Manthara felt that her sense gratification was based on her prominence in the circle with Kaikeyi. And should Ramchandra be coronated instead of Bharat, then her circle would have been diminished. And therefore, her envy was clouded over onto Kaikeyi's consciousness, and Kaikeyi began to fear the same thing, that if her son wasn't coronated, then she would lose an important prominence. So because we want something someone else has, everyone knows, or at least now and even then, of course, that primogeniture is a law, that the eldest son always inherits the property of the father. It's not a new thing, it's been that way since time immemorial. So realistically, Bharat did not have the claim to the throne. He was not the eldest son. Ramachandra was the eldest son. And everybody expected Ramachandra would become the next king. And he was qualified. And Dasarath certainly thought that. But because of envy, wanting something someone else has, this all became inverted. And Kaikeyi did her intrigue. And Dasarath was obliged to defer Ramachandra's coronation and give the crown instead to Bharat, who was not even present at the time. Bharat had been off visiting a relative in the Kaikeyi kingdom, in the Keikaya kingdom, actually. So the distance between Ayodhya and Keikaya was long or large enough that no news traveled that fast. So when Dasarath decided to coronate Ramachandra, Bharat did not know of it. Nor did he know, or would he have ever even imagined, that his mother had wanted to install him instead. So this was all news to Bharat. He had no idea what was going on. On top of it, after Ramachandra left with Lakshman and Sita Devi, they went into the forest, and Ramachandra was now disconnected from information also about Ayodhya. But having separated himself from his father Dasarath couldn't maintain his life. And one of the scenes that comes at this time is that the servants, who always gather around the king's chamber in the morning, they all were there. And they were reciting various prayers and various auspicious recitations. There were young girls there and dancers and people with food and auspicious odors of incense and all sorts of auspicious things, so that when the king wakes up, he sees everything that helps him to feel exuberant about the day. But something was strange. The king did not come from his chamber. And of course, when the chamber was inspected, it became obvious that the king was no longer alive. And the queens were immediately plunged into mourning, all three of them, Kaushalya, Sumitra, and yes, Kaikeyi. But Kaikeyi had already set herself on the path of envy. So she had a desire. Her desire was for her son to be the new ruler. And the idea that her husband had now departed did not sting so deeply as it did to the other two queens, because they could see that the whole reason that Dasarath had left his body was his separation from his son Ramachandra. So the other queens could easily see this, and they knew that the separation had come about as a result of Kaikeyi's desire and Kaikeyi's desire only. So this has all happened, and this is unknown to Ramachandra, who is now in the woods. He had gone into the forest, and to be separated from the people. He didn't want the people of Ayodhya to come visit him in the forest. So he had to be a little careful and conceal where he went. So he first came to Sringavara, where the Nishada king Guha had given him some shelter. And then he went deeper after hearing where might be the proper place to go. And now Ramachandra, Lakshman, and Sita Devi were residing near the Mandakini in Chitrakoot. While on the other side, we have Bharat, who was in the kingdom of Keikaya, and it's time for him to return to Ayodhya. But he also is unaware of what's going on in Ayodhya. And he is moving with a great retinue of followers, relatives, well-wishers, protectors, and so on and so forth. And so it's a slow progress from Kaya to Ayodhya. And he's a little disturbed by this because he's having strange dreams. He had a dream where he saw his father falling from a mountaintop naked into a contaminated water, and him being pulled on a chariot with donkeys, and all this was obviously very, very bad omens. So he knew something was not right, but he didn't know what it was because, of course, like we have today, there was no internet, no way for news to travel very quickly. So he had no idea what might be going on, but he knew that there was something not right going on. He wanted to get back to Ayodhya as soon as possible, but because he was with a big group, they traveled very slowly. But finally, toward the end, he just broke from the rest of the group and went ahead. So he arrived in Ayodhya before the others. And as he came up to Ayodhya, he could immediately understand that just as his omens and dreams had presaged, there was a stillness in Ayodhya. There was a sense of neglect, that the brahmanas didn't appear to be reciting their hymns and various mantras. There was a sense of neglect and disregard in the cleanliness of the streets. People were not out. He noticed that the gardens were not full of young people enjoying themselves. And he knew that something was certainly not right. So he thought the best thing to do was to go immediately to the palace and find out what was happening. The guards were very pleased to see Bharat and welcomed him immediately. But rather than ask them, he thought that he would immediately go to see his father, Dasarath. But Dasarath was nowhere to be seen. And so he thought, well, let me find out from the queens. I'll ask my mother. And so he immediately went to the chamber where Kaikeyi was staying. And she was very pleased to see him and embraced him, and he touched her feet. And he was very puzzled. Things were confusing. Why were things like this? There was no usual happiness and, sort of basic frivolity of people engaging in everyday affairs and doing what they needed to do. Things seemed off. So he said, "My dear mother, where is my father? I don't see him anywhere." And Kaikeyi replied that your father has gone to the heavenly worlds. And he did what was necessary, and he left instructions for you to be crowned the king. And so this was bewildering to Bharat. None of this made any sense. Well, he suspected maybe his father had left the world. What did it mean that he was supposed to be coronated king? Everybody knew Ramachandra was supposed to be coronated. Ramachandra was the eldest son. And why did he leave such an instruction? None of this made sense. Of course, as it began to unfold, Kaikeyi then explained to him the detail of how, she had asked her husband to coronate Bharat instead of Ramachandra and had asked Ramachandra to exile himself into the forest for 14 years. And when Bharat was hearing this, you know, first of all, he's grieving for the loss of his father. And secondly, he's trying to think, is this real? None of this makes any sense, you know. He would never have expected his mother to act in such a way. And when it became obvious that only such a weird occurrence could account for the current mood of Ayodhya, that this must be true, that indeed his own mother had tried to create a situation where he would be installed as king instead of his brother. And he was immediately revolted by the idea. And, you know, he asked his mother how in the world she could have acted in such a way. He was not at all pleased by her actions or by the situation that now he was the heir apparent, or apparently he was the next in line. So he knew he had to do something. So he immediately left his mother and he went to see the other two queens, Kaikeyi and Sumitra, and just to get a sense of what was really happening. And they were a little bit afraid. They were thinking, oh, has he come here now to cause some harm to us, you know? And immediately Bharat said, I had no idea my mother had any of these designs or intentions. I certainly do not agree with them. I think that there's no way I should be king. Rather, your son Ramachandra should be king. So never believe or never think for one moment that I had any part in Kaikeyi's endeavor to make me the king instead of my brother. And this very day, I shall go to the forest and I will bring Ramachandra back, because I do not want to be the king. I am not fit to be the king. He said, actually, just as a donkey cannot mimic the gait of a horse, nor a sparrow the flight of Garuda, no one can equal Ramachandra, and he's the rightful heir. So whatever it was that Kaikeyi did, I do not agree with it. And if indeed this kingdom is mine, then as my first act as the proprietor of this kingdom, I will give it to Ramachandra. So he immediately rounded up others and various brahmanas and soldiers were commanded. He said, let there be a road built to where Ramachandra has been exiled, and we shall go, and I will bring him back and install him as the actual king. I have no desire to rule this kingdom. So immediately craftsmen were set at work to build a road. They made the direction, and the entire kingdom went, including the three queens and many advisors and brahmanas and others were in a joyous mood, thinking Bharat is actually a virtuous soul. Who would have been able to set aside being the king and understand the reality that the kingdom really did belong to Ramachandra? Who would have been able to do such a thing? He is certainly virtuous for not having any desire to cling to the kingdom that was not rightfully his. So in a joyous mood, the citizens who had actually been plunged into a kind of morose consciousness as a result of Ramachandra departing and renouncing the kingdom due to Dasaratha's command, were now in a good mood. They were now in a happy mood, and they were approaching the location where Lakshman, Sita, and Ramachandra were residing. But it took some time to get there. And first they met Guha, who was a king of the Nishadas, who was in Sringavera. And Guha was a little suspicious because he had helped Ramachandra, and he was devoted to Ramachandra. Now here is Bharat, and he's with an army. So what are their intentions? Are they planning to finish Ramachandra? Are they planning to fight a battle to ensure that they can continue to rule the kingdom? This could easily be the case. So Guha was, he set aside his own army and prepared them for a battle. And he decided that he would himself approach Bharat and find out what his real intentions were. So Guha, he approaches Bharat, and he is introduced to Bharat. And Guha says, I see that you have come with such a great collection of soldiers and others. What are your intentions? I hope that you are satisfied with the rule of Ayodhya and you have not come to further harm Ramachandra. And hearing that, Bharat was kind of pained. He said, never think that I have any ill intentions toward my brother. In fact, I have come to demand that he take the kingdom of Ayodhya. That's my intention. And when Guha heard this, he was relieved because he thought, now I was afraid maybe we would have to fight and protect Ramachandra, but instead he could understand that Bharat loved Ramachandra and had no intention of continuing as the ruler as his mother had tried to set up. So they spent a night with Guha in Sringavera, and then the next day Guha explained that near the Mandakini over by the mountain Chitrakoot, that was where Ramachandra had taken up his hermitage, his renunciation, that he had spent a short time with Guha, but he would not accept any charity from Guha. And when he had met Guha, he had matted his hair and accepted nothing except for sleeping on the bare ground. And so now the whole group made its way through denser forests towards Chitrakoot, where Sita and Ram and Lakshman were. And of course, in the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, we're hearing that actually this time was not so dismal for Ramachandra and his wife and his brother. In fact, they kind of enjoyed being in the forest. That, Sita liked the simplicity of forest life, that she could spend so much time with her husband, otherwise if he had been in Ayodhya, he would have had his royal duties to attend to. And things were simple. They would wake up and there were sages and they would have Lakshman bring them some forest vegetables and things, and they would eat simply. And they were surrounded by birds and trees and animals. And we can see that actually happiness is not so dependent on external material arrangements. Somehow or other, in our consciousness, there's this persistent misunderstanding or this persistent hallucination that happiness is only possible with very carefully created external arrangements of various kinds. We have to have so many things. But actually, sometimes happiness is quite easily found in simple surroundings. Whenever a door closes, another door opens. Whenever something is taken away, something else is given. Whenever we find something, we also lose something. This is something Ramachandra will say in a few minutes here as we get to that part of the story. So the group is making its way, and Bharat goes ahead with Shatrugna because they can penetrate the dense forest much more easily. Meanwhile, Lakshman, who is standing guard over Sita and Ramachandra from a mountain, can realize that there is a great army heading their way. He can see the banner, the Kovida, and he can hear the rustle and clamor of chariots and people and horses and a great multitude. And he's thinking, this has to be Bharat. And certainly he has come to try to finish us off. So he goes immediately to Ramachandra and he says, my dear Lord Ramachandra, today I shall finish this brother of yours, Bharat, for his desire to usurp your throne. They are coming. I can see the banner of Ayodhya, and I can tell that they are coming our way. Somehow they must have found out where we are, and I will personally send him to the abode of Yamaraj, and then I will take the life of Kaikeyi, the sinful queen. And I think there is no sin in doing these things. And Ramachandra replies, my dear brother, why do you think these things about Bharat? Certainly he has not come to take the throne. In fact, he is as devoted to me as you are. I've never thought this for a moment that Bharat has come here. Rather, he is in separation and he wants to see us. So we should make some preparations for their arrival as best as we can. And in a short time then, Shatrugna and Bharat arrive, and immediately Bharat goes and pays his obeisances to Ramachandra. They embrace, and Bharat begins he's determined. He's trying to persuade his brother to take the throne and come back. So here we have again, we have the desires of the citizens of Ayodhya. We have the desire of Dasarath. We have the desire of Kaikeyi. And all these desires are different. When we come into the material world, we have this great machine which can offer various material, apparently desirable objects or desirable situations. And we try to figure out how we can have them, how we can get them. But we have providence or karma or the will of the Lord. These are subtle nuances of the same thing. There's a current that flows. And that current moves things not the way that we imagine they should be, not the way always that we want them to be, but rather time and tide move through the world that we live in, sometimes creating very unexpected turns of events, very unusual situations. And though we may have imagined something, something may have been planned, something may have been expected, but rather something very different happens instead, at the turn of a moment. Sometimes something very, very different happens. So, as it is with, the Ramayana and this story of Ramachandra on the eve of his coronation being instead exiled, and Bharat coming back from a trip to see relatives, discovering that his father is no longer living and that the kingdom has been passed to him instead of his brother. All these are unexpected turns of events. And for Kaikeyi, she imagined that her son would be thrilled to learn that he was the next king, when actually he was completely disgusted with the idea and with her, and contemplated even killing his mother. But he did not do that. But he was totally opposed to the idea. So we see how the material nature never is exactly what we think it is. And things never go the way we think they will completely. They go maybe for a few paces with our desires, and then they go in another direction. And if this happens with the Supreme Lord, we can just imagine how far away things can go for our own selves with our plans in the material world. Now, Bharat begins to try to convince his brother, saying, "My dear Ramachandra, I am not fit to rule this kingdom. Everyone knows that you are the eldest son. I don't know what possessed my mother to want to sway our father Dasarath to give the kingdom to me instead of to you. But whatever it is, it makes no difference." She was obviously sinful. And as sons, we have to set right what our father did wrong. This could not have any legitimacy to it. And of course, in saying these things, Bharat has to disclose the fact that Dasarath is no longer living. So this is painful, of course, to Lakshman, Sita, and to Ramachandra, who are just now first hearing this news, because they also have been in isolation from the news of what's going on in Ayodhya. And Bharat says, "See all these people of Ayodhya, they have come because they want to see you coronated, and I want to see you coronated, and it is the right thing. Our father may have somehow or other been bewildered by his wife Kaikeyi, but it makes no difference. We should set everything correct, and we should do the right thing. So please, I have never wanted this kingdom for a single moment. You must come back with us and take your rightful place as king of Ayodhya." Ramachandra, in a very grave mood, replies in a very interesting way. He says, "We cannot undo what has been done. As rulers, we have to live by virtue and truth. Since our father made this decree, since he made this stipulation that I should be in the forest for 14 years, who are we to set this aside? Again, a ruler lives by his word, by his adherence to a particular commitment. Rulers can't just suddenly change their mind for no apparent reason, based on reasons that people could see from the outside simply are self-serving. So, Lord Ramachandra rejects this proposal by his brother Bharat. And he said, just see, in the world that we live, every loss or every gain will soon become a loss. That every meeting will one day be a separation. And death is our constant companion. He rises with us, he walks with us, he accompanies us wherever we go, and comes back whenever we come back. And this is the nature of this world. So therefore, to simply try to arrange something for our own comfort or for our own sense of how the world should be is both pointless and a waste of our lives. Rather, we should do whatever it takes to build virtue and to serve the Supreme Person. If we do that, then whether we have or we don't have, whatever is said or whatever is not said, all these things have no real meaning. So again, this is Krishna consciousness in a nutshell. That we are like little boats in this tsunami of material existence. We're being pushed along by big waves. We don't know where they're going. We have our mental desire of what we would like to see the world do. And we can go here or there to try to enjoy that desire, but suddenly we're ripped away from our desire and pushed upstream, or rather downstream by the current. We're pushed heavily. And we may be dragged away from whatever we thought or whatever we imagined in the stroke of a moment. And yet, this is not the purpose of life. This is what most people have as the focus or purpose of life, but it is not actually to try to develop spiritual focus, to try to give our lives to the Supreme. That is the purpose of life. So whether we're blown by the winds of fate or the will of the Lord or providence, as is commonly the terminology that gets used, wherever we're blown by those forces, if we are trying to serve the Supreme, that will actually be the real thing. So I'm over time here. I'm just going to cap it off here and say that, of course, Ramachandra does not go back with Bharat. He tells him, I will come again when 14 years are over, when the vow by our father was taken. I will come again. But for now, you should take the throne. And of course, Bharat takes some padukas, some sandals, and he asks Ramachandra, you please stand on these. And therefore, I will place these on the throne, and these will be the ruler of Ayodhya until you come back. And I will meditate on them and rule in your behalf, only waiting for you to come back. And Bharat would go back to Ayodhya. There, he would not even live in the palace. He lived outside in a hut, and he ate forest fare, just like his brother was eating in the forest. And in this way, he ruled until eventually, you know, the Ramayana gets to the stage where we learn about Ramachandra coming back after having reclaimed Sita Devi from Ravana. Okay, so any questions, comments, or yes?
Well, I was kind of thinking, because with a lot of Lord Ramachandra's pastimes, with these Maryaga Purusha, you have to follow, say for example, following the rules like very, perfectly. So, like sometimes someone might ask, like, well, couldn't some of the things be taken as like Niyamagraha, like following the rules, but like all this bad stuff happens, or all this suffering happens because of it. What would you say to
That's a good question. Niyamagraha actually has two definitions. One of them is acting whimsically, in other words, rejecting all rules and regulations. And the other one is accepting the rules of regulations strictly, but the implication is that one is following the letter but not the spirit of the law. So this is an important thing, and I think as devotees, and even as a movement, as ISKCON, we have to constantly meditate on this, because it certainly is possible to follow the letter of the law and not the spirit, or to get caught up in unimportant details and leave aside the important details, or to just simply feel that no restrictions are necessary. None of these are the correct way. So it's a straight and narrow path through learning exactly at what stage something is either becoming too lackadaisical, or when we are following some minor aspect of Vedic formula and ignoring some major aspect. So this is the nature of winnowing out where we should place our emphasis. And make no mistake, this is where you make it or break it in Krishna consciousness as life goes on. It's always easier to cling fast to minor formulas and let the real essence of Krishna consciousness somehow drift away. It's always easier to do that. And so if we're not engaged in a dialogue with ourselves, trying to discover if indeed that might be happening, then you can rest assured it will happen. As an individual, as a movement. It can happen individually, and it can happen as a movement as well. So this is a kind of dialogue that can happen, should happen individually, and should happen in our movement as a general kind of dialogue between devotees. And indeed it is happening, Lord Ramachandra knew what should be focused on and what should be left aside. What is the actual important thing and what's not so important. In this particular case, Lord Ramachandra was demonstrating the importance of, as we say, leadership, living by the codes that leadership itself makes, or the codes that previous leadership had made, So this is kind of, I think an essential principle. And in one sense, Ramachandra is sort of the incarnation of perfect leadership. That's, I think, kind of a good way to think of Lord Ramachandra. He's kind of the Supreme Lord's incarnation of perfect leadership. Of course, what's his name? Prithu is as well, but Lord Ramachandra is more well known. And we can see that Lord Ramachandra's pastimes are not so flowery like Krishna's, you know, with so many different details and relationships. And, you know, Krishna does all kinds of sneaky and wild things, you know, because Krishna is not held by anything. He's not demonstrating, you know, the perfect Vedic anything. He's demonstrating what it means to be God with no holds barred, you know. But Lord Ramachandra is, you know, so that's kind of Lord Ramachandra's mood. And, you know, I think that Niyamagraha is an important thing to meditate on because it's not a minor issue. It's really what makes a difference between people who are kind of asleep at the wheel in devotional service and those who are recognizing that Krishna never lets us get off the hook by just following formulas, you know. Yes, we do have regulations, yes, we do have formulas, but we can't just follow them to be following them. We have to keep in mind what the real goal is, which in our case is to gradually develop a deeper and deeper commitment to serving Krishna. And if we're awake to that, then generally all the, as is said in Bhagavad Gita, we just gave that class in Zoom to 26 Second Avenue, all the purposes of the Vedas are served just as, you know, water in a great body of water automatically is the purpose or the any purpose that was served by a small well in a great body of water, that purpose can easily be served. So similarly, one can serve all the purposes of the Vedas if one knows the purpose behind them. In other words, one can satisfy all the Vedic literatures and all the things that are incumbent upon us by understanding what the real purpose of the Vedas is. If we follow and serve that, then all the little details, whether they're exactly manicured, exactly we make them, you know, letter perfect, is not of any significance, you know. But that's how I'd respond to that. Any other questions or comments? So we're way over time, but I'm not keeping you from breakfast because there's no breakfast. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Lord Ramachandra. All glories to Radha Govinda Dev. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees. Hare Krishna.